Great. And great, we are live now, and I'd like to start today's talk out by way of thanking you all for joining us. Thanks especially to our guest, whom I'll introduce in just a few minutes. I wanted to briefly give a background of this lecture series. This is our second year of providing free public lectures to the public from experts. This year, we are completing the series with Charlene's presentation today. We started out the series in September with Noam Chomsky. We've had the honor of having him and the Pulitzer Prize winning writer, Chris Hedges, and many others throughout once a month. And the reason why we have this series is because, as we've seen recently, in the United States especially, but also around the world, just the way in which misinformation campaigns, disinformation campaigns, fake truth, fake news, post-truth, all these different campaigns with certain agendas, they have really done a lot of damage to providing the public with fair and free and open and true and accurate information. And because of that, it's super important that universities and colleges like GCAS College, the Global Center for Advanced Studies, provide the public with a venue space to hear experts, to listen to their stories, and so that the public can make their own minds up with respect to what is true. Well, today, I have the privilege of introducing an award-winning author and also a friend of mine. It gives me great pleasure. Our guest today is an award-winning author who wrote a memoir entitled Undertow, My Escape from the Fundamentalism and Cult Control of the Way International. She gave 17 years of her life to this cult, the Way. Afterwards, she then graduated from Rollins College, which is in Winter Park, Florida. And for more than a decade, she worked as a technical and proposal writer for the software industry. With respect to her poetry, she's published widely and has been featured on WMFE-FM's Poetry Logic program and published in the Florida Writer magazine, the Tampa Writers Alliance's Wordsmith, and the Rollins Book of Verse, 1885 to 2010. Her essays have appeared in Shifting Gears, Small, Startling Moments in and Out of the Classroom, and ICSA Today, the magazine of the International Cultic Studies Association. She is a member of the Florida Writers Association, the Authors Guild, and the ICSA. She lives in Florida with her beloved husband and also a dear friend of mine, Professor Dr. Hoyt L. Charlene blogs about their travel adventures together. She writes on cults, fundamentalisms, and whatever comes to her brilliant mind. It's a great pleasure to see you again, Charlene, and welcome. You're muted.
Thank you, Preston. It's a joy to be here, and I appreciate this invitation to speak to this group very much, because this group in particular that I know about consists of educators like yourself and students, and you're interested in education. So that is what I'm interested in. I think, and Preston and I were talking right before I came on, this culture that we're in around the world is lacking in a lot of education about high control groups. And I was in the Way International, as Preston said, for 17 years. When I say in it, I mean I was in it. In 1970, I wanted to make the world a better place, just as you all are doing with your educational efforts. But I went a different route that time. We were experiencing protests against the Vietnam War in the 60s. Of course, in 70s, some of you may remember. Some more of us with this color white hair remember it differently or more up close and personal. But we were in that environment. And in '68, we had those two horrible assassinations of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the leader of the civil rights movement. And then not long after that, of course, was Robert F. Kennedy, who was campaigning to be president. So this darkness that was in the United States, of course, was a fertile ground for people looking for answers and certainty and truth and justice, and we still are. So my concern is that we're in a similar time with, as Preston mentioned, this with me earlier, this misinformation time and difficulty finding facts that you can rely on. So it's an honor to share my story in this venue to get what I have to say into the conversation. So before we go further, as you can see on the screen, I like to define my terms when I talk about cults. And this is a definition that I like. There are many, they all tend to have the same essential features. This is from the International Cultic Studies Association that we mentioned earlier. And that's a loose, not loose, but it's a network of academics and family members and counselors and former members of groups that were damaging. So let's start looking at this example of this definition. And there are three parts in this definition. And the first one is that a group like that is going to exhibit excessive devotion to some person, idea, or thing. So you've got a person or an ideology or something that there's an expression of obsession about, of undue attention to, that takes over everything else in your life. The second feature is employing unethical, manipulative, or coercive techniques of persuasion and control. So the key word to me is this unethical manipulation. I was talking to a few friends recently, and I cited a Netflix movie that I thought illustrated this unethical manipulation. It's not about a cult, but it's called Sneaky Pete. And if you've seen it, you probably understand why I'm saying this, because Sneaky Pete was a con man and smooth as silk. So it took even people that thought they knew him were bluffed by his act. So this unethical manipulation comes in different forms, in political cults, religious cults, self-help cults, whatever. But we want to be aware of what's really going on. Am I being shuffled into something that maybe isn't in my best interest? The third quality, designed to advance the goals of a leader's group, the group leaders. You know, you've got the guru at the top and other leaders that are just as adamant and controlling as he is. And I'll get into my story as an example of these things, but a group like that is designed to advance the goals of the leaders. Okay, and to the actual or possible detriment. It may not happen to everybody. It depends on your experience in a group, but this continues on by saying this detriment could occur to the members and their families or the general community in general. Okay, so that's what I'm talking about when I say cult. There are other people that may not agree with this, but this is, I think, the best way for me to go about telling my story is to make sure that people understand what I mean when I say cult. And I don't throw that label around lightly. I don't, just because somebody doesn't agree with me and I see them following a leader that they don't question, I don't say, well, that's a cult. Because this is a serious business, I think, and words to me matter. I'm a writer. What can I say? The next screen, if we want to go down, this is a list of 3 resources. If we can get down to those. And And there are 3 different resources I like to recommend to people. The first one is a relatively new book, and it's written by Robert J. Lifton, who did a lot of research on brainwashing, thought reform, and what you might call mind control. He interviewed Nazi doctors to find out what were they thinking. And followers of the Japanese cult that put off the sarin gas in the subways some years back, and other things. So he has a great book, Losing Reality, on cults, cultism, and the mindset of political and religious zealotry. And I love that word zealotry, because a zealot is focused, is driven, is committed, is loyal, and has these blinders that will not deter that zealot from veering to the right or the left. And for me, that lasted for 17 years. So I'm grateful I was able to fling off those blinders, although it wasn't much of a fling at first, flinging off, because it took me a while, but we'll get into that. The next resource is Janja Lalish, and she taught sociology at the University of California in, I think it was Santa Cruz, but you can look it up. Anyway, she's written many books, one of which I like the best here is Bounded Choice, True Believers in Charismatic Cults. Now, she herself was in a political cult, so she has a firsthand experience with a group like that, just like I have. And she was kind enough to read my book and endorse it. You can read what she had to say about it in the front pages of Undertow. And then lastly, as we've already mentioned, the International Cultic Studies Association. And there's the website. So they have many articles. They have conferences every year that are international conferences. And I spoke at one in Bordeaux, France in 2017. I recently published on my own website the paper that I submitted for that conference and read there about breaking the power of cult symbols. So if you want to read that, you can go to my website and search for that and find it. But I feel that a group like this, and there are some other ones, provide information that's important to all of us to get our hands around this idea of, is mind control really true? Or how does this work? How does just a regular person become exploited by someone who's out to just use them to promote their propaganda in essence? So because we're in education, I think we need to be keen on, well, what is the difference between education and propaganda? What's the difference between mentoring somebody and manipulating somebody? So I think those themes are important to keep in mind on this topic. So thanks for putting those on the screen. If you want to get back to them, they'll be on my website. And let's get started more into my story, because as it was advertised, this is a cult insider's story. So I'm not here as a cult expert. I'm here as an expert on my story that overlapped with this group. And I use these Venn diagrams. Can't see them very well, but I like Venn diagrams because psychologically they show you how that influence can take over a person's mind. So the influence is here, the ideology, and here's you. And you get together and you're attracted to the ideology. The ideology is great. And you start dabbling in it and get more and deeper and deeper and deeper. And then finally, that's all you see. That's all that you're looking at the world with. So let's get into my story too about this experience. So in 1970, as I say, going back a little bit, I was in the midst in the United States in that environment, that upheaval, that searching. So I went off to college, to East Carolina University in North Carolina. And I chose it because my sister lived nearby and it was in a warmer climate than some other places in the United States. I live in Florida, so I like that, although it's getting hotter and hotter every year. At East Carolina University, one Friday night, I was running up the steps to the student center with a girlfriend of mine because we were going to check out a fellowship, a Christian fellowship. And I was dying to find one on campus that was serious about Bible study too, not just having fun time singing about Jesus, but getting into the text of the Bible. I had been in high school in Young Life, which is an evangelical Christian group targeting, or I don't know that I want to use the word targeting, but it may be in some cases that is the case. But it reaches out to kids who are troubled and talks to them about Jesus and getting born again and reading the Bible. So in high school, a girlfriend of mine invited me to one of those fellowships, and I reluctantly went. I really wasn't sure I wanted to get into something like that or was even interested, because I was coping with a major grief in my life, which occurred in that same hideous year of 1968, which was that my mother died of cancer. So she was young, she was 48. And I was 16 years old at the time and devastated, of course. It's like, you know, those scenes you see in World War II of London being bombed. And I know some of you are in London, Preston's there right now. But the houses, they're half gone and there's rubble everywhere in the street. So that image always strikes me when I see it, because that's how I felt when my mother died. So being Catholics and having gone to Catholic school for 8 years of my life, I was truly enmeshed in the theology of serving God, loving God. The purpose of life was to know, love, and serve God in this world so that we could be happy with him in the next world. Basically, that was a Baltimore Catechism. We memorized these questions and answers. What's the purpose of life for mankind? To know, love, and serve God in this world. Then I bump up against the death of my mother with all of that theology in place, and explosion happens, as I said, like a bomb hit my house. And the comfort I was offered at the time was the usual that you hear so often in religious circles. Unfortunately, I think that the intention is sincere. People want to make you feel better and comfort you when they tell you that God took your mother, it was her time, and she's in heaven with him now. So that's supposed to lessen the pain. However, for me, it did the opposite. I thought, well, you mean the God I'm supposed to love is the kind of God that takes mothers away from teenagers? I was 16, so I didn't have a lot of nuanced thinking going on, but I felt lost. A year later is when that friend of mine invited me to Young Life. And lo and behold, a new kind of way of looking at God and spiritual matters came to play in my life. It was exciting. There were other friends from high school that were at these meetings. We were singing. We were reading Good News for Modern Man, which is a paraphrased version of the New Testament that was very popular in the 70s. You can still buy it, but it was very popular, but it definitely watered down other versions and translations, such as the King James Version, which is, right up there as far as a lot of the translation work goes. However, Young Life said, oh, well, we can't really teach you the meat of the Bible like you're looking for, it sounds like. Why don't you go to Christian college? Go to Wheaton College in Illinois. That's outside Chicago. That is a Christian college. So I'd already been accepted at East Carolina University, and for good or bad, that's where I ended up. And 2 months into it, I was running up those stairs in the student center to go to a Bible fellowship run by an interdenominational group that was regulated or approved by the university. So they had already vetted the kind of minister that would teach there and what they would do. 2 guys showed up at that meeting specifically looking for people like me to come to their fellowship down the street. So it was, coming in like looking for recruits into the meeting, and they found me and my girlfriend. Needless to say, that kicked off my involvement with the group. The number one feeling about that night was their conviction about the accuracy of the word, as they called it, and that their teacher taught that in his Bible classes. And their teacher's name was Victor Paul Wierwille. So on the cover of Undertow, you may have seen the book. I'm showing it again because that subtitle, My Escape from the Fundamentalism and the Cult Control, there we go, of the Way International. So those last 3 words is actually the actual name of the group. It is still in business today. And at the time, as it does now, it markets itself as a biblical research, teaching, and fellowship ministry. Well, a biblical research ministry right there down the street from the university. And they had this great fellowship. They had coffee houses. In the 70s, the coffee house was a cool place to go. We had incense burning and, food and beer and all of that in the usual coffee house, and poetry readings and guitar music. At the Ways Coffee House, which I went to the second night of my showing interest in this group, I went back there to that house and I saw all these loving people and they were welcoming and I loved it. And I felt very comfortable until the one guy that brought me there said, well, do you want to learn how to speak in tongues? Now, I don't know if you know what that is, but it's a phenomena that many people experience in life, and they're Christian. It's a Christian-oriented phenomena. Some people call it glossolalia. In Young Life, they said that's a gift. Not every Christian gets that. That's special. And if anybody says they can teach you how to do it, watch out. And there was this guy in the way saying he could teach me how to do that. And I flipped. I thought, oh my goodness, this is not as good as I thought it was. Maybe this isn't right. And I go into this part of the story in my book. It's all in there. And I show how I come around. I give myself, well, if I don't like the group, I can always leave it. And we're learning some good things. And I kept it up until I believed that God wanted me to drop out of college for the agenda, for the goals of the way. There are people that will tell you that if you meet the cult leader in person, before you get involved much or find out much about it, that encounter is very powerful. And it was for me. And the fact is, I met Dr. Wierwille in person before I even took the basic Bible class that the Way used to reach out to the world. And it eventually was translated into Spanish, German, French, maybe, and Dutch, I think. And the name of that class at the time was Power for Abundant Living. And before I even took it, I took it in December of 1970. I met Dr. Wierwille in Ohio. I went with some women from the fellowship in Greenville off campus, and we went to a women's retreat, as the world calls it. The Way called it advance, because we don't retreat from the world, we advance in God's word. So we're looking at a group that had its own jargon, symbols, slogans, and things that the insiders knew what we were talking about when we would say things like, we're going to get the word over the world. And we knew what that meant. That meant get Dr. Wierwille's teachings over the world, because we thought he was teaching the word as it should be taught. I go off to Ohio, and I hear Dr. Worrell teach. I met him in person the day before he got to the podium to teach. And he was dressed in overalls, and he was outside with his brother and his, the vice president of the group at the time. They were working on the farm. This was a farm, his family farm in New Knoxville, Ohio. And it was snowing that day in November. The snow returns in my story at several times. And I look at it now as sort of a sign, a metaphor. You know, I got snowed in some regards on some certain things. So snow has that meaning for me. I met Dr. Worrell, and that night the next night he gave the teaching at the podium. I want you to hear him talk yourself. So I'm going to read a little bit, maybe 5 minutes worth or less, about the night right before he gave that teaching, what a woman told me and my girlfriend that was with me. And then I want to show you how I felt when he got to the podium and taught. So my girlfriend and I were housed in a little house in New Knoxville, Ohio for this retreat or this advance. And we met a woman that was staying there too. And she'd been in this group longer than we had. She'd been involved quite a while. And she sat on the bed in our room and told us a story. And she said, "You know about Dr. Worrell's revelation, right?" She asked, and I said, "Maybe. I'm not totally sure." Neither was Debbie, my friend. "Tell us," Debbie said. Wendy began. Dr. Worrell started the way because he parted ways with his church in rural Ohio. He thought he lacked, quote, "the power of God," unquote, to help people in his church, despite his earnest prayers. Apparently, he had not learned what he needed in seminary. After praying about this in his office one day, he said he heard God speak to him out loud. God said he would teach him the word like it had not been known since the first century if he would teach it to others. Doctor could hardly believe it himself, he said, but that's what happened. "That's why we're so special, so blessed to be here," Wendy said, and waited for our reaction. Debbie and I were stunned. I then remembered Earl saying something like this, and Debbie agreed, but I guess we'd been so busy and overwhelmed that its impact eluded us until this very minute. Hearing Wendy gave me the chills. This was real, like a miracle, like God telling Moses the 10 Commandments. Wendy said that to be sure he heard correctly, Worrell prayed with his eyes squeezed shut and asked God to give him a sign to prove that he made that promise. Sure enough, when Worrell opened his eyes, his gaze fell on the window across the room in his office, and even though it was a sunny day, he saw snow so thick he could not see the pumps at the gas station across the street. That is in print in a book called The Way Living in Love. So if you ever want to read it, it's in that book too. Debbie and I were dumbstruck. We hadn't heard about the snow part of the story. From then on, I would call that claim of revelation the snow story. Wendy finally added a final touch. After that episode, Worrell said he threw out, listen to this, Worrell said he threw out all his theology books and studied nothing but the Bible. That's important to remember. And he said that in his Bible class. So it's not just this woman telling us he said that. For me and thousands of way followers, including many who to this day follow Worrell's teachings, that story established Worrell as God's man, right up there with the Apostle Paul, the man of God for his times, according to Worrell. Our man of God's unique revelation story sounded like a story from the book of Acts, but taking place in modern times. The book of Acts is in the New Testament in the Bible. It talks about what happened in the first century from the point of view of They say Luke, who traveled with the Apostle Paul. I didn't even consider doubting this. I did not think it false or ridiculous or a lie to rope people into the way. My vulnerability made room for the power of the claim. God talked to people in the Bible. Why shouldn't he do so now? Without resistance, the snow story became the community belief that held us together the way the Christmas story binds other Christians. Without it, at least for me, Werewolf would have been just another preacher among thousands of preachers. Werewolf's claim that God would teach him was not a vague one. It was Werewolf's piercing hook. On it, we hung our hearts. On it, we thrust our belief that Werewolf was God's man. The next night, Werewolf gets to the podium. Welcome, all you beautiful women of God. That's the way he would say beautiful. Dr. Werewolf called that out as he strode up to the podium. It was a Saturday night of the women's advance, and his wife had just introduced him. He and his wife lived at the Way headquarters on the farm. They had 5 children. The 2 youngest ones were still living at home because they were attending school, local public school. Dressed in a striped suit, his hair slicked back, our man of God did not resemble the man in the motorcycle shed that I'd met in the overalls earlier. 300 women stood up and applauded, overflowing with love and admiration. He invited us to take our seats and open our Bibles. His authority and energy emanated like rays of blinding sun. Ladies, God has entrusted us with spreading the accuracy of his word around the world, he said, his smile flashing like a camera. We must bring God's truth to every lost person looking for answers. By God's grace and mercy, we can do it. His voice mesmerized me. Its cadence lifted me into a dream state that led me to belief. Bouquets of yellow flowers gracing either side of the podium beautified our teacher's presence. His steady confidence drew me to him like a fish on a line. I watched in awe as he pounded his Bible while teaching and reading verses. At the end, he called us to dedicate our lives to the work of God, and he also warned us, Satan loves it when people turn away from God's matchless word. We must stand together in this ministry that God has given us, manifesting the love of Christ and speaking the word. That's how we'll defeat the adversary. Remember, you are the apple of God's eye. Stand. And having done all, stand. We rose to our feet, cheering and laughing, praising the Lord. I didn't worry about Satan right then. I was bathed in comfort and bliss, and I was enthralled, unable to concentrate on anything but Werewolf and what he was saying. He waved goodnight as invigorating organ music filled the room. He had an organist and a pianist there always, and that enhanced the emotional crescendo of his words and fostered an atmosphere of commitment. So there you have it, really. That atmosphere of a commitment, that atmosphere that we were doing the work of God was intense. My cult story, when I talk about it like this, I try to put it into 4 parts. What my vulnerabilities were, which I think I've already told you, the death of my mother and my definite desire to learn about the Bible. Not everybody walking around at ECU was looking for that. And many people who got into the way weren't looking for that either. They were looking for a hippie commune type of thing, some of them, or just a place to learn about the Bible, but not get that serious about it. And they didn't stick around maybe as long as I did, or they kept their ties to the community and their families intact and just went to a Bible fellowship at the Way once a week or once a month or something like that. So keep that in mind. There were different levels of commitment, different levels of involvement. Therefore, you're going to hear different stories from Way people that have been in the group, depending on their experience with the group, depending on their age, their location, their education, their experiences inside the organization of the Way. I've already told you part 2 pretty much about the recruitment of myself there at ECU. And this commitment part, though, I want to get into a little more because that involved what I did after I dropped out of college. In 1971, in the fall, I was accepted by Dr. Worrell into his leadership training program. This was intense. This was 2 years back to back on the farm, learning personally right from Dr. Worrell, the founder of this group. And he wanted to get us trained to be leaders for his ministry. It was growing quickly. It was growing because people like me around the country were flocking to it. There was a very large active fellowship in Wichita, Kansas, and as well as East Carolina University in that Greenville, in that town. In North Carolina had other fellowships. Chapel Hill had one, and I think Durham, but I can't remember exactly, but I know Chapel Hill because I know people that were in the Way Corps from there. And then, of course, California. Dr. Worrell initiated that outreach pretty much himself. Went to Haight-Ashbury in '69, and he'd read about this group called the House of Acts out there, and he thought, they look like I need to reach young people. I've got great followers here, but most of them are church people that used to be with me in my church, and I need to get out there and get the Jesus movement was happening, and so he went out there and he recruited leaders there, and they started helping him move the ministry around the world too. And some of them came into the Way Corps program with me. In the Way Corps program, as I said, it was 2 years back to back, and we had certain things that we had to do to prove we were loyal. We had 5 principles to adhere to, having to do with Bible study and physical training and positive believing to bring money into the organization. And then we had to be willing to go anywhere where we wanted us to go after we graduated. So we lived together in mobile homes. We ate together downstairs in the building where Will taught his Bible teachings upstairs, and we had summer school classes up there. We had weddings too, and I got married in that room in 1973 at the end of the Way Corps training. But the Way Corps training was different for all of us in that it depended on what job Werewolf assigned you to, as to what kind of experience you had. And also I was engaged practically the whole time. So I was distracted in some ways from what other people were doing on their time off, which wasn't much. We were too busy with activities, manual labor out. We would chop wood in the woods down the road. This farm was big. It was 147 acres. It had cornfields and soybean fields and had a patch of woods, just like most farms do out there. They have a patch of woods as a resource for rabbits and wood for fireplaces and things. So I want to read you a bit quickly about when I entered the trailer to start my Way Corps training. In 1971, this was September, and it was cool outside. The weather in Ohio wasn't too cold yet, and it was peaceful on the farm. That was one thing I did like. We were away, we were isolated. So remember how isolation can contribute to control of other people. We were a far cry from the town. We were out of earshot from public view and control or oversight. There was no oversight of Werewolf. So our collective test began, and we found out fast how seriously Werewolf took communal living for us. He stayed in his house, The second core women, that was me. I was in the second group that went into the program. We moved into Trailer 6, a familiar place to me since I'd lived there the previous winter while retaking the Power for Abundant Living class. It was a manufactured mobile unit anchored like the other nearby trailers into the ground. I carried my belongings from Trailer 8, my summer housing, making my way through the newly added living room and into the bedroom of Trailer 6. Surprise. Instead of the few mismatched beds from the last year, 5 new identical wooden bunk beds, enough for the 10 of us, were snug in a row, about 2 feet apart. Oh my God, how would we manage in here for 2 years? The worst part was down the hall, 1 bathroom with 1 toilet. 10 of us, 10 young women and their hair dryers, toiletries, makeup, and other stuff. Adding to the crowded uniform atmosphere were the matching blue and green plaid bedspreads on the bunks, draped like flags over coffins. They sent a clear message. Personal identity does not matter here. I'll just never forget that sight. So I took my flowery bedspread, stuffed it in a suitcase, and we stored our extra stuff up in the barn on the farm. Now, from my view, every one of us in that program sincerely wanted to serve God. We did. We had that idealism of youth and conviction about Dr. World being a man of God. Some of us became distracted, as I said, from another deeper layer of activity that was going on at the time. And I get to this in my book near the end of the story, where I really found out about it, and that was Dr. World's alleged sex ring, a little harem going on behind the scenes. I've since found out some of those women, my friends, were involved with that. It was a seduction. It was posed as love. If you do it with love, it's fine. God just wants you to do things like that with love. You hear about these things with other groups, and it goes on, unfortunately, because wherever there's an imbalance of power, what's possible abuse. Wherever there's an imbalance of power, whether it's a religious leader, political leader, business leader, we're hearing those stories more and more now in the news. Unfortunately, fortunately, we're hearing about it more, and it's getting attended to, and people are going to jail. But in that environment, I've come to find out that it was viewed as an honor to serve the man of God that way. And one woman I know wrote her memoir about that experience. Since my memoir came out, once you disclose your story, other people are more likely to disclose their story to you too. So I'll leave it at that. People have told me their stories. This commitment for me went, besides being engaged during that time, I had that leadership training from where we'd get up at 5:30, we'd pray together, run down the road, exercise, run back, take a shower. We could do that. I learned how to take 2-minute showers. My husband loves that because I can get ready to go to, which we're not going anywhere right now because of the pandemic, but discipline didn't scare me. And my discipline life, in many ways, I can say that training wasn't that bad for me. And in some ways it helped me. I learned how to lead a meeting. I learned how to do a lot of valuable things like pay attention to details, because my job, one of those paths in my training was the biblical research end. And Dr. Roll assigned me, I never knew why exactly, but to work with a woman that he'd had collecting manuscripts from the British Museum, from the University of Leiden in Holland or the Netherlands, where they had these old manuscripts of Aramaic texts from the Old Testament and different things. And what made him do that? Because there was a scholar, a theologian named George Lambza, who has, you can go, there's a website with a lot of his work. He translated some manuscripts into English and produced what he called the Lambza's Bible. So Dr. Worrell invited him to come to the Way headquarters on the farm in the summer school. He taught the vocabulary and some of the grammar and things like that. And one of his students was a woman, and she's the one that taught me and some other people in the Way Corps. I worked with her 4 hours a day. And then at the end of that second year, I got married, as I said. The commitment was go wherever Dr. Worrell tells you to go. So he sent me and my husband to California, to LA. We were going to save LA. We were going to spread God's word over LA. And there were already some fellowships out there. So in my book, I go into that section of what we did in LA and my baby being born at that time. And how when she was born, my focus shifted to taking care of her and raising her. And I didn't pay attention to other things like I could have or should have, meaning my marriage was going down the drain. And that has happened with a lot of marriages that were based on commitment to the Way and revolved around that subculture. And once you give up that subculture for whatever reason, or even within it, other problems come to light. Because I think, I'll just tell you, I'm going off script, but I think that depending on the vulnerabilities of a person getting involved in a group, they get in there. If they're a drug addict, this happened. People were on drugs and they found the Way Fellowship and they got off drugs to do God's word and spread it. Their parents were happy to hear that, to see that. Gave them purpose. So they go in and they continue the hamster wheel of activities in the Way. If you want to be spiritual, you've got to take this class and the next class, then go out and be a missionary, which we called the Word Over the World Ambassador Program, where you'd be assigned with other believers for 1 year to get a part-time job and spread the word, and then come back and you get a pin from Werewolf. I didn't do that program because when it's initiated, I went into the Way Corps. But the problems, for instance, I said drug addiction, they weren't attended to. Nobody went to therapy. Our therapy was the Way Fellowship, believing the Bible. If you didn't believe enough to get your healing, it was your fault for not believing strongly enough. Dr. Worrell taught what he called the law of believing. What you fear, you'll get. What you believe for positively, you'll get. Today, you see it in the United States anyway, in these mega churches, and it's called, what they teach there is the prosperity gospel. Well, that term wasn't around back then, but that's pretty much was part of the picture going on in the Way. So those problems that weren't addressed appropriately were just smacked over, a Band-Aid was smacked on top of them. And consequently, there's repression and depression and all of these covered up problems. And it's sad. It really is heartbreaking because of the damage that does to people. And, some of those women, as I mentioned, didn't make it. Okay, I'm getting teary, wow. So I'll change the subject a little bit and keep on going. But I know we're getting up on time. We're already at 10:50. But the commitment involved for me kept on going. And that research project, in the end, I get to telling you, in 1984, which I always say was in more ways than one, it was 1984. And in 1984, the character Winston, he's against Big Brother until the end. He he gets turned into loving Big Brother. And unfortunately, that's a cautionary tale for us today. In 1984, I was brought back to the headquarters in Ohio. By this time, there were 600 people working there. There was an office building the size of a football field. It was like a little city under a roof. The Werewolf had raised lots of money. People, where did the money come from? People always ask me that. Well, it came from selling the Bible class that I mentioned, Power for Abundant Living, and the advanced class on Power for Abundant Living, and another class on how to renew your mind to the Bible, another class on dealing with the devil, another class on Christian family and sex, ironically enough, other classes and big meetings and all of that. And the bookstore, there was plenty of stuff in the bookstore Werewolf was selling. So the money was pouring in. He had an airplane, 2 motor coaches. We had a huge ministry of music that traveled around. Great musicians, absolutely beautiful, professional musicians. And I got to be friends with some of them. So this was spread. This is a big thing. By that time, there were probably 40,000 people who had come in contact with a way to take at least that Bible class somewhere in the United States. There was a fellowship in almost every state and in 36 other countries. Today, there are still fellowships associated with the original group of the Way that's based at that farm. But there's a number of offshoot groups now. Why? Dr. Werewolf died in 1985, the year after I went back to headquarters. And that, of course, had a profound effect. Although he had designated his successor before he died. In 1982, he turned it over to somebody that had been in the Way Corps with me. So I get to the headquarters in 1984. My daughter is a little kid. She goes to the public school. We live in a house in town. There were other staff people working at headquarters in different capacities, and they lived, we called it, on the compound in a trailer. There were more trailers by this time, and the staff, as I say, had grown exponentially. So I was assigned to come back to work with that woman again in the research project. So there were just on the team, there were others working on other projects. Our boss, who was Dr. Werewolf's right-hand man overseeing the research department, had been recruited when he was 16. His mother actually lived in the area near headquarters in New Bremen, I think it was, Ohio. And he took Dr. Werewolf's class when he was a teenager and kept on going and went to college, learned Greek, kept on going, and Dr. Werewolf groomed him to use his biblical research methods. And so I'm back in that environment again, and everything that we did in that department had to fit in with what Werewolf had taught already. So we couldn't, if we found something different or something new, we had to keep it zipped. Some people before me who didn't keep it zipped, who felt compelled to speak up about it, and many of them were trained at universities in Greek or Aramaic or Hebrew or something, church history, or they found problems in Dr. Werewolf's class, which there are many. When they spoke out, guess what happened? Dr. Werewolf had a special way of letting them know that they needed to leave, or they left on their own. One thing besides working on that project that happened to me that caused me to feel I needed to get out was the discovery of the cavalier, as I say it was cavalier, plagiarism that Werewolf engaged in. Many times that he'd be called out about it, that he didn't cite his sources, such as the sources of E.W. Bullinger, who's from the 19th century theologian and scholar from England. But he was a fundamentalist, and Dr. Werewolf would use his work. He also used the work by other people, J.E. Stiles, who wrote, as I was showing Creston earlier, J.E. Stiles wrote a book on the Holy Spirit in the 1950s. Werewolf, his book on the Holy Spirit today, you look at them together and it's clear that there's a serious problem with plagiarism. So there was that. But it was an emotional thing. Think about it. I'd invested myself for, by that time, 14, 15 years. I put up with problems in my marriage where under normal circumstances, I think I would not have. But I did it because of the cause. I did it to keep my commitment. I was supposed to forgive because the Bible says to forgive. In the research department, also there had been problems that people would write in about from different places and fellowships around the country. And sometimes they were addressed and sometimes they weren't addressed. So I go into all of that in Undertow to show how conflicting that can get in the end, and how it's hard to pull out of a group that's all you have. That's all I had. My father had done his best to try to talk me out of this, but of course I rejected his warning. I rejected a warning from my boyfriend back there in 71. I rejected warnings from other people because I was convinced. It was sort of like a Joan of Arc syndrome, I call it, and no disrespect to her. But once you're that convinced that God's told you something, there's nothing's going to stop you. And so in my case, probably nothing would have stopped me. And you can't talk people out of belief. There's something they need or want that belief gives them. People ask me, well, I've got family in a cult and I'm trying to get her out of it. What do I say? And I try to get into her world, ask her what it is that appeals to her. What is she getting out of this? She might be sacrificing her life for this thing, but what is she receiving? And that's what I finally had to ask myself in the research department. Where's my abundant life? I've had this horrible up and down marriage. I'm poor, pretty much poor. And lo and behold, I had skin cancer. I didn't even know it because I kept thinking God was going to heal me. I had a recurring skin cancer growing that finally I got it taken out after I left the group. So long story short, I finally leave. I resigned from the research department. And my husband and I stayed another year because he wasn't ready to go. He wasn't academically inclined, which even though I didn't have much training, I was headed that way. Because for example, when I raised the problem of plagiarism, he said, well, who cares? That's all scholarly talk. You know, as long it's the truth, no matter who says it, it's still the truth. Something like that. And how do I know this is the truth? And it's stolen material and Werrell's been making money off of it. And that bugged me. It didn't seem to bother him or a lot of other people, but that was that. So in closing, I want to make sure we've got time to answer some questions, and I want to address them as best as I can. Leaving that group, nobody pointed a gun at me to keep me there. Obviously, people will say, well, you could have left anytime. Nobody was holding a gun to your head to keep you there. They didn't have to. There was a psychological manipulation happening over time that kept me there. And when that broke through, despite the fact I felt like I was jumping off a cliff, I clung to some hope that life would get better. So I hope that this has helped you see this topic better. And I'm here to talk about your questions if you have them. Thanks, Kristen. And thank you all for listening to this somewhat rambling here and there talk, but there's a lot more, and you can find out about it in the book, and on my website, there's plenty of articles and things. So how are we doing with questions?
Charlene, that was really incredible. I want to thank you for the courage that you have, that you had in writing the book and also in today's talk. Thank you.
well, I'm glad I can do it.
So we have a few questions that have come in through Facebook and another platform. And the question, I'll just start posing some of these to you. So the first question would be, are you happier today than you were when you were in the cult? Or are you generally happier, and can you talk about why?
Yes, I absolutely. Can I talk about why? First of all, I'm a lot older than I was then. And all I've learned and all the education that I've received since that time has made me happier, because I'm not in a cloud. I'm not under somebody's thumb telling me what the truth is. I have exercised my critical thinking muscles again. Those tend to atrophy in a group where you're not questioning, you're just floating along like a lily pad on the surface where the leaders tell you to float, more or less. So yes, at the time, at first, it was overpowering, and I thought I was happy to find what I thought I was looking for. But what I found was what Werewolf told me the word was, what Werewolf defined God as. So he had eliminated off the bat a lot of other alternatives that I didn't have time or make time or show interest in pursuing or finding out about. So I stayed within the narrow margins. And if you stay in them and don't question them, sometimes that structure can help some people. It depends. So I can't say everybody that was in the way was damaged and terrible. But I can tell you how I feel today. And I'm proud of the way I was able to meet people. I had enough confidence to meet people who could help me through education, and I could question. And that freedom to question and then reject what doesn't sound right to you or is a lie, without retribution, that's pretty much a good way to be happy.
You mentioned that in your bio, you talk about your time at Rollins College, a really good liberal arts college. Right. And was it there were you able to find as you mentioned earlier, your critical thinking muscles? and did that help? Did that academic experience help distance yourself from the emotional dependency that maybe you had while in the way?
It certainly did. I have to say, and I'll back up a little and I show in Undertow, I did start going back to college when I was still working at the Way after I resigned from that research team. And I went to Ohio State. They had a branch campus down the road. And so I started back to my education, thanks to my friend in the research department that threw out that idea. And I laughed at it at first. I said, no, I'm not going back to college. Forget it. That was 16 years ago. But I did. And thank goodness I did. So it was in that environment I started critically thinking again. One little story from that is my first writing teacher at Ohio State. One night we were in a class, and I think I have that in Undertow. And she wanted us to brainstorm a story about music or popular music, and she wanted our opinions. And my opinion? When was the last time anybody asked me my opinion? I wasn't sure what I had to say about popular music. I actually didn't have much to say at anything because I'd been in a bubble over here away from it. But Rollins definitely, and then I went to Valencia College in Orlando and continued to do more writing and reading and stuff, of course. And then Rollins College was the capstone for me. In 1990, I went there and finished my bachelor's in English. And I took a lot of philosophy classes while I was there too, which definitely helped. So
another question we have is, what award did you win with your memoir, Undertow?
It's from the Florida Authors and Publishers Association. So that I entered a contest, and we were out of the country when and I didn't get the email that I had won this gold medal until I got home. And I thought at first, what is this, a scam? And I had to look into it to realize, wait a minute, this is real. And I went to a little dinner and all, and it was very sweet. But the judges were librarians, which impressed me a lot. And these were authors and publishers that entered the contest. And I was I was overwhelmed. It was lovely and sweet.
I'm just reading some other questions. Thank you very much for that. And congratulations on the award. That's fantastic. A question is, can you talk about your experience while writing the memoir? Were you triggered in any way? And if so, how did the writing experience address potential triggers that you might relive?
Excellent question. And I love it because it's a writing question. Behind me, I've got a shelf of memoirs. I was telling Preston, I read many memoirs while I was writing mine. There's a number of ways you can write a memoir. Over the years, even before I left headquarters, I had started writing in journals just to find my feet, to sort out what I was thinking, what was happening around me, trying to make sense of chaos. That's what we do many times, many of us writers. We're right because we don't know what we think until we get it down and work with it and reflect on it. And so, yes, I have a box of more than 30 of those journals, and those were part of my materials that I used when I actually sat down. And I retired early from that writing job in a software company so that I could write the book. I'm very fortunate that my husband and I could work that out. So when I started working on it in a focused way, that was in 2017. And yes, over the years even, but more especially while I was writing the book, I did have bad dreams. And Hoyt can tell you, dreams about Werrell again and what people that I hadn't thought about in a long time. And it affects your nervous system. You're revisiting the past. It triggers your body. Your memories are stored in your body, not just up in your brain, as far as I understand from reading things. So I did a lot of yoga during those years, and 3 or 4 times a week went to a class and walked, power walking. So those things, definitely that mind-body connection is real. And I tried to take care of myself, but certainly I had some dark moments, and certainly I had some breakdown moments of wondering about publishing the story at all. I thought, maybe this is just for me. My first draft was over 700 pages. I had an editor look at that to give me feedback. She did. I worked on it 2 more years. I had another editor in New York look at it. She's worked with me. And then from there, I had a copy editor, which is a different kind of editor, and a book designer. And I have to say, I really thank my book designer for taking the picture. That's my picture of me at 17 at that Young Life retreat in Ocean City, Maryland. And to me, that picture was important to put on my cover. So I got to decide those things because I self-published my book. So is that every part of the question? There were any missing parts of that question I didn't answer?
No, that was really beautifully done. Thank you. Just a few more questions if you have the time. Do you have the time?
I have the time.
Okay, great. Great, thanks. You mentioned in your talk that you can't convince somebody, and I don't know if this is the correct paraphrase, so you might have to correct this. You can't convince somebody who believes, and it does raise the question about the recent cult formings around Trump and around QAnon.
Uh-huh.
So I wonder, to what degree do you see, well, this person is asking, to what degree do you see how education can fit into and maybe break the dependency of belief in a cult leader?
It's not the first time I've heard this question. I've been asked this question. So thank you for the question and for all of these questions. They're very thoughtful. And this is of great concern, obviously. This is our present moment in the United States and in other countries, where we're facing the challenge to democracy like maybe we haven't faced before. And it's compounded by the pandemic. And I just real quickly want to express any sympathy to any of you who've had it, or family members or friends. It's a devastating time to live in, and cults are after people looking for answers. So the online aspect to our lives now that wasn't around when I was getting into this is an important feature to be aware of. It draws people into the rabbit hole. And as I said in that one book, Lifton's book, Losing Reality, he does address, he has a chapter about Trump, our former president of the United States, and how that many supporters of him are involved with this QAnon. We don't even know who QAnon is, or I'll just say that when people are so convinced, we've got two parallel universes going on over here and in the world too. I get, depends on what country you're talking about. I know there are lots of countries represented here, but what I'm experiencing here is in the United States, and it's not the QAnon that doesn't fit the traditional framework of a cult, but there is undue influence going on, and definitely the people, like, you're probably concerned about family members or friends that just don't want to listen to you. How do you pry them out with a crowbar? My view is the best way is to try to get inside their world a minute. Say, tell me, like I mentioned earlier, what is it that you like about this? What is it? And just listen. Don't try to reason them out of it. Don't try to say they're going to, bad things are going to happen to them. Just listen to them. And sometimes if people talk long enough, they start to realize things themselves. And just be there on the other side when they're ready to do that. My dad was still there for me on the other side of this, thankfully. Does that help? I really don't have much of an answer.
Well done. Yeah,
but we can't beat people over the head. Nobody responds to that.
Yeah. Another aspect potentially to this is in a similar way, and forgive me for maybe a brutal analogy, but how that void that was created in your life when your mother passed at such a young age, and you're in your mid-teens, analogously, people are more and more out of work, and they look for stories, they look for people who will save them from perhaps bad decisions that they've made in their life, but also economic problems that I think, has been part of the United States in some aspects. So maybe that analogy works or not, or doesn't, but I think when you fall into kind of these, economically hard times, you're looking for the savior. And many people found that although Trump was a miserable and failed business person objectively, and wasn't very honest with his taxes and so on, nonetheless, he was perceived as a strong person, and people hold on to that. Does that analogy make sense?
Yes, and it does. And I think we're mistaken in calling being belligerent, being intimidating, being shameless about telling lies. There's a segment of the population that interpret that as being strong. That's not strong. The truth is strong. Compassion is strong. Empathy is strong. Education, knowledge-based facts-based knowledge is strong.
Well, you have been an incredible guest today, and also a dear friend. I'm just glad to know you, Charlene, and thank you for being strong and courageous and sharing your experience and your truth with the world. And
well, thank you for having me. I appreciate the invitation, and I want to say Thank you to all the listeners, wherever you are in the world, wherever platform you're on, that I truly appreciate your tuning into this, and carry on and be strong in the world. Take care.
Thank you, Charlene, and goodbye to everyone. And thank you so much for being part of what we're doing and trying to kind of build that knowledge together collectively. And I give you all my best. Have a great weekend, everyone. Thanks, Charlene.
You're welcome.